With the galactic-wide transition from the Republic to the Empire, the primary forms of galactic rule adapted in a number of ways. Much of the Star Wars community is already very familiar with the change from the primary militant force using clones to enlisted civilians. This event even being showcased in particular in shows like The Bad Batch. But what is less well understood is the change from Republic gear and equipment to Imperial gear. During the reign of the Republic during the Age of Conflict, which would come to be known as the Clone Wars, the gear utilized by the Clone Army of the Republic created a new standard for protection and firepower for the once peaceful collection of planets. The opponent which stood before them in the form of the droid army required much more advanced equipment than the fairly weak Judiciary Corps possessed to balance the scales. The Kaminoans, who were originally commissioned by Jedi Sifo Dyas to create the Clone Army of the Republic, were also tasked with equipping this new military force under the veil of secrecy. The armor's design they came up with was very reminiscent of the Mandalorian armor inspired by the clone template himself, Jango Fett, particularly in the helmet, which featured a similar T-shaped visor. However, the Kaminoans' poor understanding of human ergonomics meant that the Phase 1 Clone Trooper heavy armor came out strong, but wildly uncomfortable for the clones wearing it, making wearing the armor in certain situations like, say, piloting a starship, impossible. This prompted the change very early on to develop the Phase 2 medium armor, which offered less protection, but better comfort and mobility. The clone armor was an effective tool for the Republic, as it was capable of absorbing light blaster fire, and with its pressurized suit, enabled the clones to survive in space for a short period of time. But when the Clone Wars was coming to an end under the control of Palpatine, and the decision was made to transition to conscripted men and women, the Kaminoans' contract to produce the units and their equipment was swiftly revoked in brutal fashion, with the demolition of their developmental sites and cities. And so, much like the change with their galactic fleet, new manufacturers were required to equip the new galactic empire. In the end, the new Stormtrooper armor coined by the tragic storm which destroyed Kamino,
heralded by the Imperial Stormtrooper,
would be crafted in-house by the Imperial Department of Military Research. Contracts for this production and funding were dealt with under the table as per usual in this corrupt era. And so, much like Sienar Fleet Systems' transition to use the Imperial TIE Fighter, the Stormtrooper shell was born. The Stormtrooper and clone armors shared a lot of components. Both were composed of plastoid and had similar documented traits, and both maintained the signature white shell which would define the rule of the major faction. Much like the Clone Trooper Phase 1 and 2 variations, the Stormtrooper armor underwent trial periods, where the equipment was adapted to account for the enlisted units rather than the stock body forms of the previous clone army. Where the Stormtrooper armor primarily differed was in its focus on inflicting fear. In this tyrannical ruling era of the galaxy, the Empire relied on the nerves of its subjects to stay out of their way. The Stormtrooper provided this service by simply walking in the streets. Protecting was less of a serious endeavor, and it seems though who designed the armor thought the same of protecting the users. The armor was capable of protecting the user from some chemicals, dioxis not included, and to a limited extent was heat resistant. Now I stress the word limited, as most forms of blaster fire would embarrassingly penetrate this armor. Now, Lucasfilm documentation will make the claim that the Stormtrooper armor is capable of resisting most forms of blaster fire, except for those on the higher power end. But if Leia's Defender sporting pistol can one-shot a Stormtrooper, I have some serious doubts about that. In my opinion, this may very well be some well-placed Imperial propaganda. It's clear that most of the Stormtrooper armor was not quite as capable as the clone armor, despite being supposedly the evolution of the gear and having all of the previous described attributes. But functionally, the Stormtroopers were less trained and less protected by the Empire to save cost and time in the galactic rule. In all likelihood, the Stormtrooper armor's poor performance was due to the Empire's high levels of corruption. It's likely that the specifications and designs of the Stormtrooper armor were actually capable of blocking blaster fire as they said, but when put into production, the corrupt manufacturers used poor quality plastoid instead of the high quality stuff necessary as a way of saving costs. These companies also tended to use cheap, often forced labor, which results in poor standards of manufacturing. I would not be surprised at all if, when inspected up close, Stormtrooper armor was full of microfractures and fault lines in practically every plate. However, any good corrupt manufacturer knows the best way to make your gear pass quality control is to simply bribe the inspector, and I bet that's exactly what they did. This shift in quality also affected the Empire's utility tools and weapon armament. The Clone Army famously sported the DC series weapon platform, which were standard issue armaments throughout the many legions of troopers. This blaster was well capable of dismantling droids with accuracy and potency. The numerous variations for these blasters gave troopers fair choice on what they wanted to use against their opponents. The DC-15S blaster carbine and the DC-15A blaster rifle were both regarded as heavy blaster weapons, able to destroy the B-series droids with ease, as well as the DC-17 hand blaster, which was also designated as a heavy blaster pistol, making the entire clone kit from rifle to pistol a hard-hitting array of force. All of the standard issue blast tech weapons for the clone army were heavy penetrating weapons. They were great for intense combat, but due to their hard-hitting nature, used more energy and cost more to produce, running off of a high-grade Tabana gas. When the war ended and the new patrol era began, Blastech was asked to create a lighter and cheaper weapon for the infantry of the Empire. The development teams then created the E-10 compact blast rifle, lightweight, less of a sustained fire rate, and easier to produce and hand out to the enlisted troopers. Eventually, this weapon line would evolve in time for the standardization of the Imperial Stormtrooper and take the form of the E-11 light blaster rifle, created using recycled parts from the DC series weapons now being decommissioned en masse. While the E-11 was easier to wield, it lacked the range and stopping power of its predecessors, leaving the Stormtroopers with few options if they had ever come up against armored opponents. Now, luckily, the Rebel Alliance never made use of heavy armored infantry, but if they had, the Empire would have had a hard time responding. To sum up, the changes between the Clone Trooper and Stormtrooper equipment mirror the changes between the troopers themselves. Where the clones were elite, valuable, expensive professional soldiers, the Stormtroopers were cheap, disposable, and mostly professional. Now, this isn't to say that Stormtroopers are chaff. They're not. A Stormtrooper is still vastly more well-trained and equipped than their Rebel Alliance counterpart, but it's hard to argue that the Stormtroopers are anything but a shadow of the sons of Jango Fett. And if the Rebels had been facing off against the Clone Troopers at the Battle of Endor, they never would have stood a chance. I hope you've enjoyed watching this presentation, and if you want to know more about the lore of the Star Wars galaxy, check out some of our other videos in the College of Lore series. We try to make sure you have something new every week, so if you haven't already, subscribe now and drop a like down below. Also, if you have a suggestion for a topic you want us to cover, go ahead and tell us in the comment section. Until that time, I have been Sam, and thank you very much for watching.